My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and you're all very welcome to this week's Sensemaker Live. Thanks as ever to Santander for making these things possible. The next February in Beijing, one of the world's great political gatherings is going to take place, the Winter Olympics. Now, to be fair, of course, there'll be some skiing and some bobsledding and a bit of sport too, but I'm not being entirely facetious. There is an underlying point. The Olympics are surely the most political sporting events in the world, and if sport and politics are always intertwined to some extent, then the Olympics, I think, feels like the point where that knot is most tangled. We're getting together today on an inauspicious day in a way, that June the 4th today is, or really ought to be, a big anniversary in China. It's the 32nd anniversary of the massacre in Tiananmen Square. But of course, it's wiped from history in China as much as the authorities there can manage that. And the BBC was reporting this morning that an activist in Hong Kong had been arrested for organising a vigil in memory of it just today. On the other hand, today is like any other day in Xinjiang, in China, where at least hundreds of thousands of Uighur Muslims are detained without trial by the Chinese authorities. And it's that dreadful new fact which has come about since the Winter Olympics were awarded to Beijing, which has, I think, really changed this conversation. So naturally and properly, I think the question comes about whether the UK and other Western democracies which are critical of China's terrible human rights record should take part or not in the Beijing Winter Olympics in February next year. We're lucky, and I'm extremely grateful to have a great set of people to help us think our way through this today. We've got, I'm going to give a couple of medals out. It's only appropriate. We've got in silver medal, Sophie, I'll explain why. We've got Dr. Sophie Richardson, who's the China Director at Human Rights Watch. Silver medal because Sophie is joining us at 8 o'clock her time from Washington, DC, so we're grateful to her. But I'm giving the gold to Dr. Jules Boycott, who's the author of Power Games, which is a political history of the Olympic Games. And Jules is joining us at 5 o'clock in the morning from Oregon. So a clear winner on that front. But also, no less grateful actually to Hassan Judy, who's Deputy Secretary of the Muslim Council of Great Britain, who's with us, and also to John Goodbody, who is a renowned sports correspondent, largely for the Times and the Sunday Times. And I checked with John. It is true to say, before we came on air, that he has covered 13 Summer Olympics, so quite a feat. Odds not looking so good of getting to Tokyo next month, sadly. But Jules, as ever on the thinking, the usual single rule applies, which is that we want to hear what you think, we want to hear experience, we want to hear your point of view in order that we can come to a better informed point of view ourselves. What we don't want is questions. So please do chip in, put your hand up. You can press the, is it the reaction button? Yeah, reaction button and raise your hand. Or we'll keep an eye on the chat and pull people out from the chat and bring them into the main conversation as well. So one way or the other, please do join in, because that's the point of the whole thing. But if Jules, can I come to you first, because this conversation about whether or not to boycott an Olympic Games will be, I guess, kind of wearily familiar to you. I dipped into your book, Power Games, yesterday. And I wonder if you can disabuse us, I suppose, of the notion that the Olympics were ever not political. How political, what's the sort of political potted history of the modern Olympic Games?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning in Oregon. Yes, the Baron who started the Olympics, his name was Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a plucky French aristocrat whose brainchild was these Olympic Games. He would often say that the Olympics were not political. So from the very beginning, the idea was put in place that the Olympics are not political. However, from the very beginning, the Olympics have been political. After all, he excluded many groups from the early days of the Olympics. Women were not allowed in the Olympics. In fact, he infamously said that the job of women was to place the laurels on the head of the victorious Olympic champion. And also workers were not allowed in the Olympics in the early days. If you were a grape picker or a bricklayer and you made money from those activities, you were considered a professional, and the Olympics were made for amateurs. And so born out of that political exclusion came political fight back from people fighting for their rights and for their inclusion. If we're to believe the political scientist Harold Laswell that politics are who gets what, when, where, how, and why, it's pretty clear from the outset that the Olympics are political, because some people are getting the goods from the Olympics and others are not. And so that kind of moved through history. 1936 is one of the most political Olympics that people will talk to. It was hosted in Berlin under Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Actually, originally, Hitler was not that interested in the Olympic Games, but his propaganda minister, Goebbels, convinced him that this would be a wonderful opportunity to set the Nazi symbols right next to the Olympic flag. And that's exactly what happened there. Moving forward, there were always battles over the Cold War. Became a proxy for the Olympics, became a proxy for politics, for geopolitics. And so no question that the Olympics are political. Moving forward into the boycott era that we might talk about later in the 1980s, Moscow and Los Angeles. And of course, even all the way to today, when you think about when the International Olympic Committee makes rules that says that certain athletes cannot speak out, those athletes tend to be athletes of color who are there now telling you cannot say things like Black Lives Matter on the medal stand at the Olympics this summer if they transpire in Tokyo. So in a way, those kind of seemingly neutral rules are in fact political rules that exclude behaviors and in fact reinforce white supremacy. And that's what we've seen through time with the Olympics. Last point on this is that, you know, when you hear people say that the Olympics are not political, it's those same people that tend to be milking the Olympic cow with both hands. What I mean is they're benefiting from the Olympics monetarily. And so we might just keep that in mind. After all, if the Olympics weren't political, would they walk in the opening ceremonies all as one unit from one country, thereby stoking nationalism, as George Orwell talked about so many years ago? Well, they could walk in as all pole vaulters come in together. They could walk in as all swimmers come together. That would embrace the kind of ideals behind the Olympics. But instead, it's organized in a nationalistic fashion, which, of course, is further example of it being political.
Yeah. Jules, I think one of the things we might want to talk about in this conversation is how to depoliticize the Olympics rather than questioning whether or not they're political. But you mentioned the boycott era, which it coincides with my sort of teenage years. So I remember Moscow and Los Angeles extremely well. Can you just, for those of us who've forgotten the history of that period, can you remind us how? Let's start with the Moscow boycott. How did that come about, and what would you say the sort of effective it was on primarily, I suppose, the Soviet Union and the United States at the time?
Sure. I would even take it back one Olympics to the 1976 Olympics in Montreal, where there was a huge boycott of the Olympics due to South Africa and the South Africa's role in the sports sphere. And that was, you might argue, a very effective boycott. There was a lot of people that were up in arms about South Africa being able to participate in sport around the world. And they had been excluded from the Olympics at that point, but they were engaged in rugby and other sports. And numerous countries stood up against South Africa. And this was one of the main factors that kept the pressure on South Africa during that time period. Now, you're right, Carrie, that during the 1980s, everybody talks about those boycotts of the Moscow Games and the Los Angeles Games. They really affected who was eligible for the medals and who won the medals and all that kind of stuff. In terms of effectiveness, that's always the sort of lingering question. You'll hear from a lot of people that those who truly suffer from the boycotts are the athletes themselves. In fact, you have many outspoken athletes who missed those Olympic Games because of the boycotts that still feel terrible about it today, including Anita DeFrance, higher up in the Olympics here in the United States, that still talks about it in negative terms. But the question really is, maybe standing up for your principles could be worth it in terms of not participating in a spectacle That's the most difficult question I think that we face. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to win and everyone's going to lose. Like all things that are tricky and political, there are winners and there are losers. And that is what is so complicated today. One point I would just say about this with the idea of an Olympic boycott, I think we need to sort of center the International Olympic Committee in the discussion, because I mentioned Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who started the Olympics way back yonder. He got together a gaggle of counts and dukes and princes, and eventually they let women in the organization starting in 1981. You heard that right. 1981 is when this group started allowing women in, not exactly a proto-feminist organization. And they're the ones that select the host here. And they're the ones that really deserve, I think, our scrutiny. And I wonder if maybe they also deserve some form of boycott in some sort of way. After all, they're responsible for handing the Olympics to Moscow or Los Angeles, or now in this case, Beijing, even though they know full well what happened last time Beijing hosted. And so it's that political history that is the bedrock of the discussions that we're having now around these current Olympics in Tokyo, but also moving forward, like you say, into Beijing.
Yeah, great. Jules, I'll come back to you very shortly, but just let me bring in Dr. Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch, if I may. Sophie, thanks again for joining us. Are you arguing, is Human Rights Watch arguing for a boycott of the Winter Olympics?
We're arguing for a diplomatic boycott, meaning that government officials, foreign ministers, ambassadors shouldn't attend. And that is, in part based on the point that Jules just made, that, it's not the athletes' fault either that the Chinese government is, committing industrial scale human rights crimes, or that the IOC is so devoid of a conscience that it chooses to have games in places like these. At the same time, the Chinese government has clearly made 2022 games, as it did with the 2008 games, highly political itself. It wants these to be a diplomatic and a political victory, and that is well within the grasp of governments to deny Beijing. There's no reason that governments can't celebrate athletes before they leave for the games or when they come home. They needn't accompany them, and give Beijing the propaganda victory that it deserves.
And do you think that
it thinks it deserves?
Yes. Do you think a diplomatic boycott would have any effect at all?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it goes down in history books as having been a different kind of games and significantly different to what happened in 2008. When we also cautioned governments that they shouldn't be sending senior officials, and they did, and that became very much part of the Chinese government's narrative about what a success the games were in a political and diplomatic sense. So I do think it would matter. It would lend, I think, some important heft to, some of the other, in our view, more pressing human rights related efforts where we're encouraging governments to undertake with respect to China, not least the urgent need for an independent international investigation into crimes against humanity being committed against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic communities across Xinjiang. That's where we want diplomatic efforts concentrated these days.
Yeah, Jules mentioned right at the end of his comments there the effect of the 2008 Olympics. What effect do you think they had on China's image or the status of China?
Well, the Chinese government obviously has used it extensively to, mark its sort of return to the world stage in a prominent position, and its assertion as a world power and capable of hosting in spectacular fashion these kinds of events. From our perspective, though, the legacy of the 2008 games is the radical expansion of the domestic security apparatus, the rise in the use of pervasive surveillance technology, which is going to be a challenge in 2022. We should come back to that issue as well. But also the Chinese government, made these very sort of shallow challenges or shallow commitments to respecting human rights in the run-up to the 2008 games, that not only did it fail to fulfill, it actually targeted some of the people who tried to take those commitments seriously. You may recall that the Beijing Organizing Committee authorities agreed to allow for some specific protest zones in Beijing, and one of the activists, a man named Ji Suzlin, who tried to get permission to protest in one of those zones, was detained in Beijing while he was trying to get a permit to go into the protest zones. was subsequently sentenced and spent 3 years in jail, was sentenced to other non-crimes over the course of the subsequent decade, and died in 2019 as a result of untreated illnesses and ill treatment sustained in detention. And I think his story, in a way, is that of Xi Jinping, but also one of the signal differences between 2008 and 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Sophie, one of the problems you might have is that when you look at the history of how the 2022 Winter Olympics were awarded, in the end, only 2 cities bid for them. One was Almaty in Kazakhstan, the other was Beijing. And the truth is, you would have had problems with either of those, wouldn't you? It points to something, a really fundamental problem in the way the system operates from the perspective of an organization like yours.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the excellent point that Jules just made about bringing a greater focus on the IOC itself and how these decisions get made. Since that time, we watched the IOC adopt, at least on paper, some commitments regarding human rights. And of course, both the IOC and the Chinese government say that those commitments don't apply to the 2022 games because they were adopted after those games were awarded. But I think the reality is that the IOC is perfectly willing to talk about human rights commitments in places where it's very easy to do so, and not at all willing to countenance them or implement them in places where it's tough. We couldn't even persuade them to do the kind of human rights due diligence that's expected of all commercial operations, including events like an Olympics, ahead of the 1-year mark to the 2022 games. And I certainly doubt they plan to do it this year either.
Okay, Sophie, thank you. We'll come back to you shortly as well, but let me turn to Hassan Judy from the Muslim Council of Britain, if I may. Hassan, are you there?
I am indeed.
Thank you for joining us. I put the same question to you as I put to Sophie. Is your organisation in favour of boycotting the Winter Olympics in Beijing?
Yes, we are.
You are. And was that in any way a difficult decision to make, or was it blindingly obvious to the Muslim Council that that's what should happen, given what's happening in Xinjiang?
So I guess, Gary, let's take a step back for a second. And of course, there's no one size fits all with a boycott. There's many types of boycotts, and I think Sophie already mentioned one potential example of that around a diplomatic boycott, and that's certainly one option. But before we get into that, let's just take a step back a second. Whether it's athletes, whether it's politicians, whether it's anybody else, spectators who are going to be attending in Beijing in February next year, knowing what we know today, can you, as athletes, as politicians, as others, can you truly attend those games in good conscience? I think it's something for those who are planning to go to ask yourself, knowing what we know today. What do we know today? Without laboring the point too much, we've all read many articles, I'm sure, and many news pieces about what's happening in places across China, not just in Xinjiang. Mass sterilization, forced labor. The End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition believe that 1 in 5 cotton garments on the global market has involved Uyghur forced labor in its supply chain. This is humongous numbers here. The mass sterilization is just beyond belief. Population control, and a couple of months ago, the China's U.S. embassy tweeted in a very bizarre tweet, which got a lot of negative feedback, understandably, where they said that these re-education camps, where these Uyghur Muslim women were being interned and undergoing mass sterilization campaigns, these were good things because these Uyghur Muslim women were no longer baby-making machines. This is their phrase that they were using. And this is a world power. How on earth can we be attending games hosted by such world powers in good conscience? Number one. And of course, I haven't even mentioned there's a cultural dimension to this, targeting of the Turkic and Uyghur communities, but of course there's a religious dimension to this as well. Mosques, hundreds of mosques, according to reports, have been either partially or fully demolished or converted into other buildings, and imams as well, and religious figures. I think a recent report last month said 630 imams and religious figures have been detained or imprisoned since 2014 as part of these human rights abuses. So again, I take us back to the question, knowing what we know today, can you attend in good conscience? Number one. Number two, and perhaps just to the analogy, the 1936 Berlin Olympics has already been mentioned, and it was only 3, 4, 5 within a decade that, of course, the Holocaust and other terrible crimes against humanity happened by that world power and everything that came with it. Knowing what we know today, of course, it's easy in hindsight, but knowing what we know today, would we as the UK or other nations have attended the 1936 Berlin Olympics? Again, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but here in China, we're not talking about hindsight. These are things that we already know. We don't have to wait 5, 10 years to find these out. The facts are here. So why are we not acting? Well, fortunately, there have been some positive and proactive actions. It's been really positive to see some of the MPs in Parliament really taking this issue to heart. Nusrat Ghani, Ian Duncan Smith, Lord Alton from the House of Lords, pushing amendments to the UK trade bill around genocide, securing a couple of weeks ago the successful parliamentary motion recognizing the treatments of Uyghurs as genocide. This is not a light thing to say. It's not every day that Parliament passes a motion to say that something is genocide. Why is our government not listening? And the countless Jewish groups across the UK and the world who have raised their voices, making analogies between this and the Holocaust. These things are not done lightly. This is unprecedented since World War II.
But let me just jump in because I think we can all see that. We can all see how your question, how can you go in good conscience, is a really difficult one to answer in the affirmative. But I suppose just to sort of push back a little on that, the question might be whether the risk for an organization like yours that cares about so deeply about what's happening in Xinjiang is that this becomes a substitute for real action, a proxy for doing something important rather than and a distraction from the important things that we could be doing. And is that must surely be a concern that, so we don't send our ice skaters to Beijing, and we think we've done something, but set against the scale of the problems you're describing, we've actually done nothing at all.
And of course, and that's why a boycott isn't only something in isolation, whether it's a full boycott, whether it's a diplomatic boycott. I think it's part of an arsenal. It's part of a wider strategy around applying leverage, around applying pressure. Why are we doing this? It's about forcing China to action. For the last several years, we have been calling, I say we as in global, many voices across the world, calling for the Chinese government to change its course, to listen, to take note, and they have been oblivious. They have just thrown it back at all of our faces to say, don't interfere in our internal business, etc. This is not political interference, this is human rights, and it is a shame on the world to allow such actions to be taking place, and we are not using all the levers at our disposal to apply pressure. Now, of course, we could be saying, between now and the end of 2021, if the UK government was to change its policy and to say that actually, and as the Liberal Democrats have advocated for Senator Davey a number of weeks ago, to say that we should boycott, then now that starts to apply pressure on Beijing. And if other countries follow suit, Beijing will start feeling the heat, and they might start to say, well, actually, this is pretty serious. These people are using their leverage on us. Maybe we should change. Maybe we should have some concessions. Maybe we should allow independent investigations to come into Xinjiang and to look at what's happening. Maybe we should do X, Y, Z. So it's part of a whole package that we need to be considering, and we need to be using all our levers to apply pressure on a global superpower who, unfortunately, is just not listening at the moment.
Okay, Hassan, thank you. I'll come back to you as well. Finally, let me just, John Goodbody, as I say, veteran of 13 Summer Olympics. I appreciate I've made things difficult for you. That's quite a difficult setup. You must, obviously, you've been around this track before, the question of boycotts, and you've covered Olympics at which boycotts were in place. But what view have you reached over the course of your career about the effectiveness and the desirability of the kind of boycotts that we've seen and are now being argued for?
I think that the general view that I've held over the years is that boycotts usually don't work. As we've already discussed, the 1980 and 84 games were two examples of this, where, as usual, it's the competitors themselves that suffered. it's arguable that the 76 Olympics, when the Black African nations boycotted the Games because of the fact that New Zealand rugby team had welcomed South Africa, who at that stage were banned from the Olympics, to their country for a series of matches. And despite the fact that at that stage rugby union was not part of the Olympics, hadn't been since 1924, and therefore whether in fact how much that influenced the change in the appalling apartheid regime that was present in South Africa up until 1990, 1991 is debatable. The thing that I've always felt about picking on the Olympic Games is that the people who call for it do not call simultaneously for a boycott of all sorts of cultural activities with China, on this occasion with China, or with business activities with China, which are, of course, very widespread, not only in Britain, but in the rest of the world. So that I feel that it is, as ever, over the last 50 years, it's been the competitors and the Olympians, many of whom train for years for their great ambition to compete in the Games, who suffer. They suffer more than really anyone else. And I am wondering where the line is drawn. For instance, to give you an example, and I'd be interested to hear how Hassan feels about this. In 2004, during the judo tournament, an Iranian world champion deliberately weighed in 2.5 kilos over his body limit, so he could not get in to the competition because his first competitor, who he was fighting, was from Israel. And when he returned to Tehran, he was given a prize of $125,000 and also a ticket for Mecca. And what one wonders is, where do you draw the line? Where would Hassan draw the line? Should the Iranian competitors not compete in the Olympic Games against Israel? Should other Arab countries, other Muslim countries compete against Israel? Iran, as we all know, doesn't recognize Israel as a state.
Okay, John, I'll come back to Hassan with that later on. Was I right, John, when I said at the beginning that it seemed to me the Olympics were the most political of the sort of major sporting tournaments? They're more political than the World Cup, aren't they?
They are, and the reason for that is because they're so widespread. You see, there is a limit on the number of countries who participate, men only, of course, in the men's FIFA World Cup, who participate in the FIFA World Cup. Whereas at the Olympics, it's so widespread, and what one doesn't always realize, being British, is that there are certain sports which are of no interest really in Britain whatsoever, but are of huge interest in other countries. And that is why politically it is viewed as the most significant event in international sport. Okay.
John, thank you. There are a couple of I think what I'm trying to do is not just have a discussion that we could have had in 1980 or 1976, so there are a couple of strands, I think, that come out of the conversation so far, which I want to try and pull on. One is, and I'll come to you on this in a second, Sophie, if I may, how we deal with a country that is as integrated to the global economy as China is. It seems to me it's one thing to isolate the Soviet Union back in the day or South Africa, but China presents a different sort of conundrum for us. And the other one, which Andrew Girdwood has been mentioning in the chat, is the question of sponsors and whether sponsors might become the sort of Achilles heel of Olympic finances. But before I come to pick up on those things, let me just bring in my colleague Ellen Halliday, because Ellen was part of along with Seb Jones, put some of the slides, the sort of a little information pack together at the top of this. Ellen, will you just very quickly run us through some of the things you found when you were putting those slides together?
Yeah, sure. So we've already touched on a few of these things. Slides sort of serve as a summary. So, I mean, Louise in the chat was talking a lot about the concerns about, athletes, those who want to participate in the games. This is just a few stats. We can see that 3,000 athletes have been training and preparing for the Winter Games. So, how much do you have to think about their careers, their interests, something to think about. And then just some basic details here about the kind of sports going on. Obviously not as many sports as the Summer Games, but still, quite a lot of separate events taking place across 2 weeks. And if you go to the next slide. We've also mentioned some previous boycotts. Perhaps John was around for quite a lot of these, and he mentioned the 1980 Moscow Games, which was the most boycotted games in history, with 66 countries staying away. All of the games that have been boycotted in the past are Summer Games. So this would be the first games to be potentially boycotted, first Winter Games to be potentially boycotted. So yeah, the key ones here really Moscow, and then the 1984 one as well in the USA that John also mentioned. And if you go to the next slide. This kind of comes to the crux of what Hassan was talking about. The concern, the reason why we might want to boycott the games are largely due to human rights concerns, and of course primarily the atrocities in Xinjiang, or as Uyghurs would call the region, East Turkestan. There's a lot of evidence out there, and as we've said, we've all read a lot about the situation. So how much do we value these human rights concerns, in contrast to the athletes' interest, the sponsorship, and so on, that we should come back to? Of course, there's also Hong Kong, which is a fast developing situation with the national security law, and indeed other legislation set to come in this summer, which will even stop people leaving Hong Kong. Yeah, next slide, please. So what impact can a boycott have? The kind of judgment here that we found from various sources is that actually perhaps it didn't have that much effect politically. The quote here from the CEO of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and on the left-hand side we can see that 80 countries actually still attended, so there wasn't a consensus in boycotting it. So did it have that much impact? And then the next slide. It's a contentious issue in the UK. Again, Hassan mentioned that there have been MPs who have been supportive of the boycott, including Chris Bryant, who's a Labour MP, and Nus Ghani, who's a Conservative, who's worked quite hard to get the concept of genocide discussed in the UK Parliament. So there are those who are very much speaking in favour of a boycott in response to human rights allegations in China, but the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has so far said that that's not something that they're going to pursue. And in 2008, obviously a very different situation. Potentially at the time, British people would be most concerned about human rights in Tibet. 72% said that they were against a boycott. We don't have polls for the current situation, but that gives you a sense of perhaps people's awareness of human rights issues in China, at least.
Yeah, also, I suppose, aware that the Summer Games were coming to London in 2012, which might have played on people's minds back then. But Ellen, thank you for that. Andrew Girdwood, can I just turn to you, because you're in the chat. You're the person who's finding this easiest. I think, you're sort of, if you haven't got a flag for a boycott, you're knitting one under the table right now. So, but you've been talking about sponsorship and whether that's the kind of the entry point, the sort of leverage point that people could use. Just run me through that.
Let's make sure this never happens again. The IOC shouldn't be able to pick wherever they want and then wave the banner of, yay, it's sports, they're magically immune to all your concerns, let it happen anyway. Nor should they put athletes in this situation. I don't want to attack people, But this is happening because the IOC have decided it well, and they're empowered to do so by their sponsors. And if I was a big brand, I would be ashamed of the human rights atrocities that have just been listed in the short 30 minutes that we've been talking. Absolutely be ashamed. Why would I want that my brand associated with any of that? Well, they seem to be hoping that we don't notice. So a boycott isn't to punish China. I don't think China will care. The boycott is to send a very clear message to sponsors to say, look, this is like the bare minimum that any event you choose to empower should be a halt to. What next? You going to sponsor a COVID super spreading event? Oh, well, maybe they will.
Let me, Andrew, thank you. Let me come back to Jules Boykoff on that, if I can. Jules, if you're there, to what extent, it's interesting, isn't it, that cities are reluctant to put their hands up to host, certainly the Winter Olympics. And I wonder if post-Tokyo and all the troubles that they've had, whether the Summer Games will be more problematic in future than they've even been in the past. And they've been a problem since at least Montreal, haven't they, where the city paid a heavy price for hosting them. In the end, do you think that the sponsorship, the finances might be a bigger lever than even government action in this, in this arena?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question you're raising. First of all, in terms of the factor that fewer and fewer cities are keen to host the Olympic Games, as was mentioned previously, that's how we got in this situation in the first place. Bidding on the 2022 Winter Olympics, which was originally quite robust. There were countries around the world, Oslo, Norway, Munich, some towns in Switzerland and elsewhere that were putting forth bids for the 2022 Olympics. But people pushed back in all those places. They had referenda in some of those places where the people who lived there said, no, we don't want the Olympics, which raises the question of why. And so just as a little side note before I get to the sponsors, there's a lot of good reasons why. I mean, there are specific patterns when it comes to hosting the Olympic Games. First of all, overspending. The Tokyo Olympics are a shining example. They were supposed to cost $7.3 billion. They're costing more like $30 billion. The second factor is the militarization of public space. In order to protect the Olympic spectacle, the security forces are allowed to get all the special weapons and laws they'd never be able to get during normal political times. Gentrification of the Olympic area, forced displacement. Last time Beijing hosted the Olympics, 1.5 million people were displaced to make way for Olympic venues and sites, 1.5 million. And finally, greenwashing, talking a big green environmental game and then not following through at all. It's those factors that have combined up to have people around the world say, no, thanks. Why would we want that? The Olympics are popular so long as they're not happening in your town. In terms of the issue around putting pressure on some of these corporate sponsors, there are around a dozen or so worldwide Olympic partners, such as Coca-Cola, Panasonic, Alibaba, Dow Chemical. And the thing about them is they're capitalists, they're not altruists, and they're in the long game for the Olympics. And they tend to stand by their man, which is in this case, Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee. There has been pressure on groups like Airbnb, another one of these big worldwide sponsors, that doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. You might, in some cases, not China, but in some cases, be able to leverage some change out of the domestic partners. So you're seeing right now in Tokyo, some of the domestic sponsors no longer want to be associated with an Olympics that 80% of the population doesn't want to have happen this summer. And so you're seeing them tend to back away. But I would say overall, one of the best levers is not necessarily these corporate sponsors. I'm not saying don't try, but I think it's really trying to put pressure on the International Olympic Committee and do what these other cities that I'm talking about did, which is to say no to the Olympics in the first place instead of having them arrive in your town.
Yeah, because the corporate sponsors, Jules, I mean, they must be absolutely vital to the economics of running a winter or a summer games. I mean, in the end, it has to be a weak spot for those who think they shouldn't take place, shouldn't it?
Yeah, let's put a finer point on it. You're exactly right, Kerry. So the corporate sponsors that I'm talking about, they're the worldwide partners and domestic partners, that 18% of the International Olympic Committee's revenues come from those corporate partners, 18%. Another 73% come from broadcaster revenues, which are also corporate partners. So when more than 9 out of every $10 that roll into IOC, International Olympic Committee coffers, come from those two sources, yes, you'd think that they'd have a lot of leverage. On the other hand, they have a lot of motivation and incentive to keep the Olympics going because they've dumped all these millions, or in the case of NBC, where I'm coming to you from, billions of dollars, some $7.75 billion NBC has put into the Olympics from 2022 to 2032. And with that kind of investment, it would take a lot to push them onto the side of the critics.
Yeah, we always end up at the same point, which is folks write to the BBC and complain if you want to get something done about this. But let me turn to Sophie, Dr. Sophie Richardson, if I can, because the other people are talking a lot in the chat about what's changed since some of these sort of historic boycotts that I've talked about. And I was intrigued by the question of the relative ease, it seems to me, with which you could isolate South Africa back in the day, and perhaps you could see that that would have an effect. Or the Soviet Union, different proposition, obviously, but not in any sense as integrated into the world as China is these days. It is a much more difficult proposition, isn't it, to try to isolate China in any sense than it was either of those two sort of flashpoints in the past.
Yeah, it's not impossible, and there are a couple of different pieces to this discussion that I want to come back on. And one is, John's very good point that that for example, the Springboks tour of New Zealand didn't necessarily bring apartheid to an end immediately. But I would argue that that 81 tour had a transformative effect on politics in New Zealand and on New Zealand politicians' perceptions of New Zealand's role in human rights worldwide. That's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, and it's New Zealand. Come on.
I married in. I'm obliged. But this was, for some people in New Zealand, this was the equivalent of being involved in something like the US civil rights movement. I mean, people were out on the barricades for weeks at a time and protesting, and laying down ideas about what New Zealand should represent internationally. And that was not a small thing. So I don't want to suggest that there are no consequences to this kind of activism. But on the corporate issue and sort of the financial and economic issues, just to be clear, Human Rights Watch is not only a proud member of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uighur region, but we are deeply involved in discussions with a number of different governments that are pursuing all manner of constraints on different aspects of trade with the Chinese government, particularly regarding Xinjiang and forced labor, the inability to do adequate human rights due diligence, but also around Xi Jinping's crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, given that the national security law applies specifically also, not just to individuals, but also to companies. And the net effect of crimes against humanity against Xinjiang, the coming Olympics, what's happened in Hong Kong, the role of forced labor, cotton, all of these issues are combining, I think, to create much more political pressure for certain kinds of trade restrictions. I've already spent part of my day today reviewing some new proposed legislation here in the US that would actually impose new export controls on different kinds of surveillance technology that we now know the Chinese government uses for human rights violations. There are now different versions of what's known as rebuttable presumption legislation in about a half dozen different countries. And the idea there is that goods made in Xinjiang will be rejected if they cannot be shown to be free of forced labor. So I realized that, that John's core point was, why put constraints on the Olympics, but not other kinds of economic activity. But I actually think there is a very large discussion getting going about the problematic nature of trade with China, that businesses said, let us sell stuff and democracy will follow. It obviously didn't pan out that way. And I think governments are increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that major companies from their countries are profiting from repression, and that needs to change. But just to Andrew's point really quickly, I think there's a lot of work to be done around consumer activism too. The top sponsors, as Jules said, are massive companies with huge investments. And I think there's room for consumers to make their choices at a cash register about which companies they're going to support or potentially punish for pretty egregious behavior around China and human rights issues.
Yeah, okay. Hassan, can I bring you back in? Because I don't know whether you want to respond to John's earlier question about whether there's a slippery slope here if we allow, do we end up with individual athletes making choices about who they want to compete against and so on, or whether actually, if you're more interested in the question of how you could leverage questions of corporate sponsorship or broadcasters, whether that feels whichever of those you want to go at, really.
Sure. Listen, I'm not here to comment on actions of individual athletes. What we're talking about here is action at a government level, at corporate sponsor level, and we're not talking here about political differences. I think this is a human rights issue, and I think it was Dominic Raab who back in October 2020 said there comes a point where it's not possible to separate sport from diplomacy. But then we get into this whole debate about political interference, and the Olympics should be this, ubiquitous, utopia where it's all about sport and it's all lovey-dovey, and we all get together and play with each other, etc., and compete with each other. But as we know, and as we've discussed today, the Olympics are not depoliticized, and perhaps that would be something to aspire to. But whilst they are not, governments and superpowers across the world, such as China, are using it as a PR game to promote themselves and to promote what they're doing, and to impose or to project a powerful image of their political might to the world. And China only has itself to blame if the PR game is used the other way, when countries decide that they won't send their athletes, and of course all their politicians or other dignitaries. And of course I completely get the point, John's point, very, very fair in terms of who's hurt the most by this. It's the athletes. Well, I'd slightly disagree with that. I think it's the Uyghur Muslims, the Turkics and others who are, I think, hurting the most at the moment. But of course athletes will suffer, these athletes who have trained for 4 years and qualified, etc. And if that is a barrier to some, then as Sophie said, there are other options. There are diplomatic boycotts. Do we really want the royal family, members of the royal family, attending in Beijing next February, etc.? We need to really be thinking deeply about these issues to say, is this the kind of world that we want to live in, and what levers do we have to apply pressure for real change?
Okay, Hassan, thank you. Can I bring Louise Simpson in from the chat? Because I just want to spend a few minutes trying to understand whether there is a route to depoliticizing the game, because I think listening to Jules, you have this sort of overwhelming sense of us clinging to the sort of empty shell of a dream that is it was perhaps never quite what we thought it was in the first place, but it's harder and harder to sustain. And Louise, I think you were suggesting a solution that I think has been around, which is, what if we just said the games will be in summer games will be in Greece every 4 years. You take some of the sort of circus elements out of it, and we just say that's what it's going to be. Is that what you had in mind?
100%. I mean, I'm really thinking of the athletes here. It's their lives, it's their careers. I completely understand the political side of it. And yes, if you could get all the political people not there, fine, they're not needed. The people that need to be there and that want to be there are the competitors. So yes, just take it back to Greece. And even if it isn't the real Olympia, create a new Olympia. And then you don't need the sponsorship. You don't need the buildings being rebuilt every 4 years. You don't need this massive money machine going around it. It then just naturally becomes for the sport, and the sport will come cleanly through that. And the competitors will compete. Yes, they need to survive, all the rest of it, but they are competitors. They will find a way. I really think we should really, for the Olympic Games, we should think primarily of the sportsman. And the Olympics came from Olympia. Why not? Just send it back there. But, you'd have to decide where the Winter Games happen.
Okay, maybe Switzerland. John Goodbody, let me come back to you if I can, because that's an idea that has kicked around for a while, isn't it? The idea that if we just located the Summer Games somewhere, then, as I say, some of the circus, the circus every 4 years could be driven out of the equation. Has that idea ever really been taken seriously by the sports, do you think?
It's been thought about, as you said. I remember my great friend John Rodder of The Guardian, unfortunately now dead, who was involved in this and argued against it. I mean, there are disadvantages. I mean, if you took it back to Greece, you don't know that there's not going to be a problem such as we had in Greece when the colonels were in charge. And quite suddenly, you've got a political situation whereby, I'm terribly sorry, but the colonels are in charge here. We've got a dictatorship of the military, and the games are taking place next year. What are we going to do then? The original idea of Baron de Coubertin was that the game should go round the world and would act as a stimulus to sport in all the countries that where it takes place. And this happened in London. I mean, we all remember, I mean, the huge enthusiasm for the games, the wonderful volunteering and everything else like that, which took place in 2012. And then there's the question of the Winter Olympics, where that would be staged. And the Winter Olympics is more of a problem, really, than the Summer Games, which is already, you know, we know where it's going to be: 24, 28 in Los Angeles, in 28, Paris 24, 32 is now almost certainly going to be Brisbane. The Winter Games are more tricky because there's quite a lot of facilities that have to be built in small places where there's not a natural afterlife for the facilities.
Yeah. Okay. Let me come back to Jules, if I can, because Jules, I'm intrigued to know whether you think this notion of depoliticizing the games is just a piece of fanciful nonsense. Are they inherently so political that any idea of depoliticizing them is bound to fail?
First, on the issue of Greece and returning them to Greece, it's not clear that people in Greece actually want that because of what happened in Athens in 2004, where there was a whole trail of white elephants left in the wake of the games, overspending, militarization of public space, and so on. As a political scientist, in terms of the depoliticization question, I view it as a little bit fanciful that we could actually depoliticize the Olympics. I agree with Hassan that maybe it's like a longer term goal, perhaps. But, you know, I think that I look at the games as actually an opportunity to fully embrace the politics that are already there and have people talk about the important issues of our times. And the Olympics can be a lever for that. You know, I, for a long time, wrote about the suppression of political dissent in the United States and Canada, and try starting a conversation about that with an everyday person on the street. No one wants to talk about the repression of the American Indian movement in the United States, as important and interesting as it is. People do want to have conversations about the Olympic Games. And so talking about the Olympics can be an important pathway to having wider discussions around politics that we really need to be having at this particular moment.
Yeah, and Jules, I didn't sort of get you on the record at the top of the conversation, but are you in favor of any kind of boycott of the Winter Olympics, or where do you stand on that?
I would be in favor of an athlete-led boycott if you want to have athletes involved. And if athletes were at the forefront of pushing for a boycott, I could certainly get behind that. I think a diplomatic boycott makes a lot of sense as well right now. That's kind of where I stand at this stage, with 8 months away from the Olympics starting. But certainly if athletes were to take the lead, and we are living in a moment of what we could call the athlete empowerment era, where athletes are feeling ever more confident in their abilities to talk about politics and ever more confident to take a stand on the issues of our time. So that's where I come down on it right now.
Yeah, okay. Sophie, we're running out of time, but I just want to come back to you because my colleague Chris Cook has raised something interesting in the chat, which is he's suggesting that maybe the pressure we could put on broadcasters would be just to cover the events, not to do the, because countries, our own country did it. We used that opening ceremony as a kind of showcase for, often outdated or inaccurate image of ourselves that we want to present to the world. Maybe if we sort of de-China the games as well as not supporting them diplomatically, that might take some of the kind of showcase out of it.
It might, but I think the logical place to start is for NBC to tell all of us what exactly is in the contract. and to
Be sure the opening ceremony will be in there, can't you? Yeah.
Well, not just the opening ceremony, but is NBC going to run Chinese state media propaganda? Is it going to go where the Beijing organizing committee wants it to go and film what it wants them to film and broadcast what it wants them to film and not anything else? Has NBC asked as part of its coverage, for example, to be allowed to travel to Urumqi and speak freely to people there if it wants? Have they even tried? It's not clear. We've written to all of the top sponsors and the broadcasters to ask them what their human rights due diligence is strategy, and we have not heard back from any of them.
Okay, listen, our time is up, I'm sad to say, because we could have kept this going for a lot longer. I just want to, just a couple of thoughts to wrap up with. I mean, unlike some of the people, I'm unlike Andrew Girdwood in particular, I think I'm instinctively in favor of international sporting events. They've been a big part of the things that I've enjoyed over the years. And so I find myself, again, sort of instinctively clinging to this thing, even though, as Jules was pointing out, it's always been highly political. It's got more so, and the kind of, even Baron de Coubertin's dreams were not dreams that we're going to share. The figure that will stay with me from this conversation, I think, is 91%. The total of Olympic revenues that comes from sponsorship and from broadcast rights, and hugely, I hadn't realized this until Jules mentioned it, from broadcast rights. And we know those are organizations that do respond to public pressure, and we've seen it happen time and again in other arenas. So I think, where I come out at the end of this, I'm persuaded by Sophie that a diplomatic boycott, a boycott of that kind, that is something worth doing. That as Jules said to us at the beginning, sometimes you have to demonstrate your principles, even if they're not necessarily going to be that effective. Because I think a boycott of the Winter Games would irritate China, but I don't think there's any reason to think that it would deflect it from its course. I think it's really, really hard to argue with Hassan's big point that you can't, in all conscience, say we should go and we should go with a clear conscience and play games when such appalling abuses are happening just down the road in China. But in the end, I would love us to find a way to depoliticize not just the Olympics, but actually, the Football World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, all of these tournaments. I would endorse anything that could take us in that direction rather than giving up on the whole thing, because personally I find it a big thing to give up on. So there's me. Thank you so much for your time this Friday lunchtime. We look forward to seeing you all again next week. But for now, thank you all, and thank you particularly to Dr. Sophie Richardson, Dr. Jules Boykoff, Hassan Julian, John Goodbody. It's been really interesting, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.